Many observers and academics treat critical race theory as the next phase of the 1960s civil rights movement, a more aggressive continuation of the same struggle for equality. The 1960s civil rights era relied on a specific set of classical liberal values: incremental progress, colorblindness, and the belief that the legal system could function as an objective, neutral arbiter for all citizens. Critical race theory specifically rejects this liberal foundation. It functions as a structural critique designed to challenge the liberal status quo. The ideological roots of the movement lie in neo-Marxist political theory. Its founders adapted these ideas to analyze and dismantle the principles of American jurisprudence. Understanding the friction within modern racial politics requires looking at how the movement was constructed from these Marxist first principles. This analysis evaluates the theory as an attempt to replace the concept of objective truth with a system of structural critique. At the base of this lineage is vulgar Marxism. In this traditional view, the legal system is a passive reflection of capitalist class interests, a tool used by those who control the means of production. In the late 1970s, the Critical Legal Studies movement, or CLS, began to evolve this perspective into a more complex critique of power. This evolution took place within elite legal academias, where scholars sought to redefine the relationship between law and social control. CLS scholars argued that the law does not just reflect existing power, it actively constructs social interests and maintains hierarchies through its own internal logic. To explain how this construction worked, the founders of critical race theory incorporated the theories of the Italian neo-Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci introduced hegemony, dominant classes maintaining power through consent, by convincing society the unequal order is natural. CRT scholars utilize this framework, substituting race for class as the primary axis of power. Liberal ideals like colorblindness become hegemonic tools to legitimize white supremacy. For a strategy of change, they look to Gramsci's war of position. This involves maneuvering within dominant institutions to create a counter-hegemony that can eventually displace the reigning ideology. The adoption of the war of position shifted the focus from seeking equality under the law to a systematic effort to challenge the concept of neutral law from within. This strategy relies on an intentional epistemological break from Western legal traditions, a total departure from traditional ways of determining what is true. If objective legal standards are viewed as hegemonic tools, then transracial universalism, the idea of a single truth that applies to everyone, is no longer a valid goal for the movement. The framework replaces objective evidence with storytelling and the concept of subjective racial realities, or naming one's own reality. This shift places lived subjective experience at the center of legal scholarship, superseding empirical evidence. Critics note that subjective storytelling destabilizes the rule of law, which requires predictable, objective standards to mediate diverse interests. This leads to racial essentialism, the idea that an individual's racial background determines their perspective on truth and their standing to speak on legal matters. By removing the common ground of objective truth, the theory loses the mechanism required for a diverse society to reach a transracial consensus. This epistemological break has drawn criticism from within the legal academy, identifying severe structural vulnerabilities. Jeffrey Rosen identifies a logical failure in the rejection of objectivity. Without objective truth, the rule of law is replaced by tribal power dynamics, where facts are secondary to the identity of the speaker. Daniel Farber and Susanna Sherry identify a second vulnerability concerning the movement's moral implications. Their critique focuses on how the radical attack on meritocracy, treating it as a purely racial construct, erases the reality of genuine individual achievement. They argue that dismissing merit as a tool of racial power inadvertently parallels historical anti-Semitic tropes that were used to target successful minority groups. Randall Kennedy adds that tying intellectual standing strictly to race creates a dangerous fallacy, excluding potential allies based solely on their skin color. Finally, Alan Freeman highlights a philosophical failure in his review of the movement's racial realism. Freeman argues that framing racism as an inescapable, permanent force breeds a bleak fatalism. This perspective enervates students and paralyzes actionable, material reform. While the theory sought to address oppression, These scholars argue that its internal contradictions result in a logically and morally inconsistent framework. The movement successfully identified that institutional bias can be subtle and ingrained in American law. However, its reliance on a Gramscian foundation leads to a specific complication. It treats all universal principles as forms of oppressive hegemony. This ideological structure leaves the movement with no mechanism for building broad societal consensus, resulting in a landscape of competing, subjective narratives. Critics argue that moving away from the Enlightenment project for a radical war of position removes the very protections marginalized groups rely on to challenge state power. Objective, neutral principles provide a check on power that personal narratives cannot. They offer a transparent standard that all groups can use to demand accountability. Meaningful civil rights progress has historically relied on the difficult work of upholding objective law rather than the allure of ideological deconstruction.